Dramatized account inspired by real stories. The room smelled of antiseptic and childhood, clean linen, the faint sweetness of hand lotion, and the old matted fur of a stuffed bunny tucked under a thin blanket. A monitor hummed a quiet, steady rhythm. An IV drip made a soft, patient sound, like rain tapping on a window pane. In the center of it all, under a lamp that had been dimmed to make sleep easier, was Lily Jacobs. 8 years old, hair cropped to a few soft wisps, eyes bright enough that you would almost forget how small her body had become. She liked to arrange her things the way she liked her music, neat, with an obvious favorite placed on top. The torn bunny wore a tiny, lopsided smile. A crumpled picture book lay open beside her pillow. Someone had carefully smoothed a page as if afraid the image would fly away. Lily's hands were never far from the radio by her bed. When visitors came, she would reach for it and turn to a station that played quiet songs with gentle beats. She liked the hum of melody the way other children liked the hum of a fan. Music made the room wider. Her mother, Rachel, sat in the chair by the window most afternoons, phone balanced on her knee, eyes scanning the tiny messages that came like paper boats. She had learned to measure hope in short texts, a prayer emoji, a heart, a single sentence that said more than sentences should. On this morning, she had read Lily's last wish, spoken softly in the half-dark, with the kind of plainness only a child could carry when the rest of the world tries to make it heavy. "Can I meet Justin Bieber?" Lily had asked. Rachel blinked, a small laugh escaping her that was more surprise than amusement. "Baby, that's—" She stopped, because whatever word she reached for felt too big. Famous people lived in the kind of world that belonged in shampoo commercials and glossy magazine spreads. They had calendars and managers and schedules that would make anyone dizzy. They lived on planes. Rachel felt ridiculous even thinking about it. But Lily had already closed her eyes, as if the asking made it less urgent to get an answer. She was tired, but hope sometimes arrived in simple pieces. A sentence, a name, a brave little demand. Rachel promised to try. She promised mostly because she could not promise anything else. That afternoon, Rachel typed a post into a community page that stitched neighbors together the way quilts stitch patches, messy, practical, and full of warmth. She wrote in a voice that was equal parts plea and story. She told them about Lily's love for music, about the bunny with the lopsided smile, about the wish that sounded like a child's innocent fantasy, but felt to Rachel like the last thread she could pull on. She wrote Justin Bieber's name, because names build proximity out of air. It wasn't long before strangers began to leave small offerings, suggestions, a kind message, a prayer. Then a woman who worked at the hospital sent a private note asking if Rachel was okay with staff sharing the story with their circle. Rachel nodded yes. She wanted to say yes to anything that moved hope along. She wanted to say yes to someone who might know someone. She wanted to say yes to the idea that songs could come to the bedsides of small people. The post traveled in small, secret ways. It arrived in the inbox of a retired venue security guard named Tom, who still kept a folder of faded concert wristbands and an address book of contacts. Tom had once been the kind of fan who stood in rain to get into a show, the kind who could hum an old set list without thinking. He no longer did the jobs he used to, but he still read the community posts that crossed his feed. When he scrolled through Rachel's message, his breath caught. He had known people who knew people. He knew the etiquette of such things, how to keep it quiet, how to keep pressure off a family in shock. He also knew the difference between a request that needed a megaphone and a request that needed a whisper. Tom made a call. It was a call that began with, "Is this an unusual favor?" He spoke softly, careful with names and times, careful with the kind of secrecy that would keep cameras away. He left out details that would invite spectacle. He spoke like someone who understood the delicate choreography of goodwill. On the other end of the chain were a few quiet, practical people. A local fan liaison who still answered old phone numbers, an assistant who had learned how to make logistic problems look easy, and, finally, someone close enough to hear the words and feel the pull in the chest. Justin Bieber read Rachel's short message the way you read a confession, slowly, with a sense of the weight of it. The thought of a small girl tethered to a hospital bed asking for one last song lodged in him the way a melody sometimes lodges, simple, persistent, irresistible. He said yes. No press, no handlers sprawling into the hall, no cameras to angle the light just so. The word anonymous was a promise to Rachel and to the hospital. It meant a black car, a plain sweater, a hat pulled down low, a human arriving as a human, without the scaffolding that usually makes celebrity visible. The staff arranged for it with the steadiness of people who had seen hope proceed in peculiar, beautiful ways. Consent forms were signed, doors were closed. The hospital corridor hummed with a different kind of electricity, the kind that comes when everyone knows they are part of something private. When the car eased into the parking lot, the hospital looked as it always did, brick and glass, doors swinging with the same steady cadence. But the corridor outside Lily's room felt like the narrowest bridge you had ever walked across. Nurses traded looks that said more than any announcement could. They moved like custodians of a small miracle, soft-footed and certain. Justin stepped into the hallway without fanfare. He wore a plain jacket and a hat, a little tired from travel, and an expression that had space for whatever the room might need. He did not carry a camera crew or a press packet. He carried something smaller, a slim case with a few meaningful things and a handful of quiet intentions. A liaison who had stood in the rain at shows decades before walked a few paces behind him, and a nurse with a soft voice put a hand on the doorknob like a benediction. The curtain pulled aside and Lily looked up. That look, the one a child has when the world reveals itself anew, was a small, bright flash. She'd been practicing to seem brave in small ways. Courage is often rehearsed like breathing. But there was no rehearsal for recognition. "Hi, Lily," Justin said, voice lowered on purpose, as if afraid to wake something fragile. The words were ordinary, and ordinary in that moment was everything. Lily's face did something simple and irreversible. It softened. She turned her head, and for a breath the room held the kind of silence that feels like a pause in music before the chorus. For a moment the world measured itself in soft looks, and held still. "Are you—" Lily began. Her voice was small, and then she slipped the rest of the question free like a bird from a hand. "Justin Bieber?" It was not so much an accusation as a marvel, an identification offered by the pure knowledge children sometimes have. Recognition did not arrive because of fame. It arrived because Lily had listened to his songs and stored them in the same place she kept her best jokes and the names of the people she loved. She knew melodies the way other children knew faces. She recognized the particular tumble of his voice the way you recognize your favorite blanket. The anonymity dissolved in a single syllable. There was a minute of real human laughter, soft, uncontainable, that came from the edges of the room. Nobody pretended surprise. Nobody tried to make a show. Justin smiled in a way that admitted he had hoped she would notice, and he sat on the edge of an empty chair exactly where she could reach out and touch his sleeve. He brought out a small guitar pick, the kind that could sit in the palm of a child's hand. It was simple, not glossy, not emblazoned with logos, just a pick with a short note folded around it. He had written a few words not meant for headlines. "For Lily, keep singing." He set it on the blanket beside the torn bunny with a care that made fingers shake a little. Then, almost without business, he cued a phone to a song and hummed the introduction, like someone remembering the first time they heard something that changed them. They spoke about unimportant things that, in that room, became everything. He asked her what her favorite song was. She said she liked one that had a lot of sky in it, a melody that made her want to fling a paper plane and watch it find the sun. He said he could hum a little of that song, and he did. His voice filled the room without being loud. It wrapped around machines and equipment and the smell of antiseptic and the old bunny fur. It made the beeps feel like a quiet beat. At one point, Lily reached up and took his hand. She was small enough that her fingers could barely curl around his. He did not pull away. He held her hand as if he were holding a delicate line in a melody, something to keep steady. She looked at him with a kind of business-like clarity that made the nurse in the corner blink back moisture. "Promise me something," Lily said. "What?" he asked. "Promise you'll remember me when you sing," she said. It was not a demand for fame or memory. It was a child asking for the natural thing, to be seen, to live in someone's memory. He bent close and whispered something that the nurse later said she didn't pretend to hear all of, only the shape of it. "I promise," he said. "I won't forget." He gave her the pick. He wrote a tiny line on the inside of the note, no signatures for publicity, no pressed names, just a line about courage, and tucked the note into the hem of the stuffed bunny's scarf, a small secret for Lily to keep. Then he took a breath and did something he hadn't planned on doing. He sang. It was a private moment, one verse, a hum that began and ended with no recording, no applause. He leaned in and sang a chorus softly, a tiny lighthouse of a song in a room that had spent too long in shadow. Lily hummed along, a small sound like a bird testing its wings. For a while, they were simply two people at a bedside, human in a way that made the world outside feel like another country. When the song finished, the room slid back into its ordinary pace, but the air had changed. Something gentle had been left behind, like a footprint on a beach, or the warmth of a hand that had just let go. He stood to leave with the quiet efficiency of someone who wanted to avoid spectacle. The nurse closed the door with a tenderness that felt ceremonial. They had agreed beforehand to keep things private. The hospital staff had promised no leak, the visitors had promised to respect the child's peace. But small acts have a way of traveling. A photo slipped through, not of faces, but of a stubby guitar pick on a blanket, a bit of handwriting that could not be overlooked. Rachel posted a message later, with consent and with a grave tenderness, and the family shared the memory in a way that felt true to Lily's spirit. Intimate, grateful, honest. They did not seek headlines. They sought to hold on to what had happened, to honor it exactly as it was. The story threaded through social feeds gently at first, then faster as fans and strangers recognized the human chord it struck. There were messages that came in like slow rain, notes from fans who remembered the way a song once steadied them, donations, small and large, that pooled into something practical. A few people suggested founding a group that could grant wishes like Lily's, quiet, private, and free from showmanship. The idea gained shape like a chorus learning new words. Justin, who had promised to remember, did more than that. He spoke privately with a few non-profit partners, groups that had the experience to handle fragile requests with discretion. He offered support in a way that respected hospital protocol and family privacy, not press conferences, not grand declarations, but a pledge of funding and a network. He asked for the operation to be child-centered, run by people who had experience granting small, human wishes with dignity. He did not name it after himself in any fanfare. He signed a small, personal letter and suggested a name that echoed something Lily had said, the Sky Songs Fund. The movement that followed was not tidy. It wasn't a single person's project turned into an institution overnight. It was many small hands finding each other in the dark and deciding to act. Fans organized drives. Local musicians offered free performances for hospital wings. A community theater staged a one-light benefit. Someone donated a stash of guitar picks with tiny notes. The fund became a way for people to say, in deeds rather than hashtags, that they believed small wishes deserved sacred space. The hospital established a simple protocol. Requests could be submitted through the fund's private intake line. Visits would happen on schedule with medical and privacy clearance. Families could choose whether they wanted publicity or not. The initial seed money was shaped by many donors, not just a single face. Justin's name helped open doors to people who could make logistics happen quickly. It was the spark, not the entire fire. And from the quiet matches struck by that one bedside, a broader conversation unfolded about how to honor the small, final wishes of children without turning them into spectacle. Lily's time in the hospital was measured by other things after that visit, by the rhythm of nurses' rounds and the small domestic tasks of living in a room that had become a world. She wanted to hear songs. She wanted a paper plane to fold the way she liked it. She wanted a window seat when the sky was blue. She got all of those things, and more than any of them was a sense that the wish itself had not been silly. She died a few weeks later in the same quiet room, with her mother holding her hand and the small guitar pick tucked under her pillow. People who knew her said she went like a line finished cleanly by the hand that wrote it. The family asked for private time and received it from enormous numbers of people who understood what privacy meant, to give space and not to crowd. They requested modest memorials. They wanted to honor the way Lily had loved sound and sky more than anything. After she died, the fund continued to grant requests, sometimes to bring a musician to a bedside, sometimes to pay for a private recording studio so a child could make a song, sometimes to buy the paper plane materials that made a room feel like sky. People donated in tribute. Young musicians sent in recordings dedicated to Lily. Schools set up music corners with old guitars and some picks, small libraries of songs for children who lived in hospitals. A bench with a plaque was placed in a park near the hospital. The plaque did not crown the story with sentimentality. It simply read in modest letters the way the family preferred, "For Lily, who sang into the sky." There were no statues, no grandiose proclamations. There were small, repeated acts. A volunteer once sat and taught a child how to smooth paper so that the paper plane flew with dignity. A music teacher held a monthly class in the pediatric wing, where children could press a pick into a corkboard and write a line of a song on a scrap of paper. A local cafe donated part of a day's proceeds to the fund each year. The work felt like planting bulbs in a garden, quiet, patient, and hopeful. Justin came back a few times, always at the family's invitation and always with careful respect for privacy. He sat at bedsides, sometimes recommended a song, sometimes brought a cap or a handwritten scrap of lyrics. He never sought cameras at these visits. He attended memorials, he lent support to the fund, and on a more human level, he sent small notes to mothers and fathers who wrote him to say he hadn't forgotten the promise he'd made. In the years that followed, the fund's work touched dozens of families. Not every wish could be granted, and not every story bent toward a tidy ending. But there was a thread of dignity that stitched each moment together. The insistence that children's final wishes be treated as sacred, whether they were extravagant or tender. The fund's intake lines became known for discretion. The people who worked there learned to move like those who thread a needle in the dark, careful, patient, and very alive to the weight of a phrase. Rachel once said, in a quiet interview for a local magazine, that what she had learned was how fragile courage could be, and also how contagious. It was a small, brave question, she said, and it set something else going. People responded because they could. They didn't have to do anything heroic. They just had to be there. The story did spread beyond the initial circle. Fans wrote songs in Lily's memory. A few musicians included a bracelet or a pick in their tour merchandise, with proceeds directed to similar funds. A tiny scholarship was started for young people who wanted to study music therapy for children. The movement never became a headline. It instead folded into the quieter parts of communities that felt called to act. People remembered the image of the small guitar pick on a blanket. It became a relic of sorts. Not worshipped, not turned into a talisman, but kept in ways that honored privacy. In a mother's jewelry box, clipped to a notice board at a music school, sewn into the lining of a jacket that belonged to a nurse who'd been there that day. Little things can become anchors: a cap, the pick, a note. These objects carried the weight of a promise. Years later, on a bright spring afternoon, a bench by the hospital bloomed with fresh flowers. Children from a nearby school brought paper planes folded with care and set them on invisible winds. A small plaque read, in the family's requested simplicity, that for a child named Lily, the sky had been a place to send a song. A volunteer placed a guitar pick in the grass and let it rest there like a quiet punctuation mark. This was the legacy, not a single grand monument, but a network of small acts that made it easier for a frightened parent to ask for help, and simpler for someone with means to respond without spectacle. It taught people how to honor privacy and how to make room for human things: music, touch, a promise whispered at the edge of a bed. A reporter once asked Rachel whether she regretted sharing the story at all. She shook her head slowly. "We didn't do it for attention," she said. "We did it because someone once helped us." People think stories like this change famous lives. They do, but they also change ordinary lives. They change the way a volunteer thinks about a shift, or the way a donor decides to give, or the way a kid folds a paper plane. For his part, the artist who had entered the hospital anonymously never made a spectacle of the role he had played. When he spoke about it publicly, he always kept a certain tenderness in his words, framing the visit as an opportunity to listen. He credited the hospital staff and the community more than he credited himself. He spoke about how simple it was to show up when people coordinate just right, and he urged people to think about how to make space for privacy and dignity. He supported the fund quietly, signing letters and writing notes, and when a new child needed a song, he sometimes sat and hummed a verse. There is an old, small truth threaded through these kinds of stories. Extraordinary things often begin with ordinary bravery. A child says a name. A mother types a plea. A retired security guard makes a call. A celebrity decides to step into a room without the lights. It adds up to a life that is, for a moment, less alone. It adds up to a promise kept, simple, human, and abiding. On certain evenings, when the light is turning slow in the window and the city seems to breathe softer, you can still find people carrying small tokens, a cap, a pick, a folded note, toward the pediatric wing. They do it quietly. They are not always sure what the sum of their actions will become, but they do know this: small acts, done with respect and without curiosity, sometimes ripple much further than anyone first imagined. Lily's stuffed bunny sits on a shelf now in a small community music room. The guitar pick is tucked into a small glass jar on a volunteer's desk. Kids learn to fold paper planes there and send them toward a skylight that seems suddenly larger. The fund that grew from a bedside wish continues to work in little ways that make rooms feel larger. The bench by the hospital is a place where mothers and fathers sit and breathe and remember. If you believe small acts matter, if you believe that dignity and privacy are the truest kind of charity, please like and subscribe for more stories of ordinary courage. There are many more like this, stories that ask little and give much. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that grant wishes to terminally ill children and those that provide music therapy in pediatric care. A small donation, a volunteer hour, or a message can make a difference. Links and resources are in the description. The evening closes on a simple picture: a paper plane sliding out of a child's hand and catching a slant of light. A tiny guitar pick sparkling for a second before it lands softly on the pavement. It reads like an ending, but it is only an echo. The promise that was made in a quiet hospital room continued in the ways people thought to honor it, through small things kept safe. A song hummed into the dark. A pick given into a small hand. A bench in a park that asks you to sit and remember that some wishes are meant to be tenderly preserved. And somewhere, a tune learned in a small room finds its way again into someone's voice, and the sky above a hospital feels just a little bigger.